child about sex. It's hard enough with a neurotypical child, correct? How many of you have had this talk with a kid? How many of you have had just one talk? No, it's never just one talk. It's typically an ongoing conversation with children. It needs to be in this day and age. They're learning all about it on the playground. We live in a society that uses sex to sell everything. It's not something that you can say, oh, gee, they're almost 12, I think it's time, and just have that conversation one time. Children need to be prepared for this crazy world we live in and the crazy bodies that they exist in as well. I worked in Las Vegas in the inner city, and I worked with parents and families and teenagers, and it was a very interesting experience. Many of the teenagers that I worked with were actually in court-ordered treatment because they had worked as prostitutes. It was crazy. The sex industry in Las Vegas, the almost sex slave industry is what you could call it, is a billion-dollar industry. It's crazy, the kind of things that go on. They say what happens there stays there. Well, let me tell you, what happens there influences the culture in and around Vegas and everywhere else. While I lived there, I was invited by a fellow Toastmaster to be a guest on a radio talk show called The Sex and Money Show. Now, he asked me because he hung out with me in Toastmasters. We had a great time. And when he told me the name of his show, he said, what do you want your title to be? And I said, How to Talk to Kids About Sex. It's what I do all the time as a social worker and as a mom. And it was a very fascinating experience because I went in and sat down with the show's producer, who had a very different perspective on what sex was all about than what I did. His was, oh yeah, it's so great, it's so fun, it's so awesome. He was very Vegas-ified. And I came in with a, you know, we got to protect kids because there's crazy things going on. It ended up being a very interesting and fun conversation. I had a blast with it. But it helped me recognize that there's some important things that everybody needs to understand about talking to kids about sex. I'm going to give you 3 really important tools. The first is to use appropriate vocabulary when you're talking to anybody. Autistic children need this even more so because autistic kids, even if they're just mildly autistic, usually take things very literally. So you have to be careful about the vocabulary that you use. With the teenagers that I work with, it's interesting because I'll have them come and sit down and I'll ask them about all the nicknames that they have for different body parts. I have learned there are crazy nicknames for our more intimate body parts. But when we get to body parts like an elbow, there's only one name for an elbow. And so one of the things that I try to educate parents with is, let's only have one name for our genitalia as well. It's okay to say penis. Everybody say it. Penis. It's okay to use that word with the child. I actually had a professor who taught early childhood development. She would make us stand up and yell it. She was like a cheerleader with pom-poms. Okay, I'm not going to make you do that. But it's important, and let me tell you why. As a therapist, I heard a story from a fellow therapist who shared an incident where a little girl came into her mom and said, Daddy put his pee-pee in my pee-pee. Now, it was a stepfather living in the home. The mother was horrified. They took the child into the therapist. They worked with her. They kicked the stepdad out of the home. Finally, after working with her, they found out that the little girl had urinated in the toilet. The dad came along a little while later and also urinated in the toilet. She was horrified because his pee-pee went in her pee-pee. Now, if she had used the word urinate, which is the appropriate vocabulary word for that particular substance or activity, it would have been clear as crystal. And so it's important with children, not just autistic children, but all children, that we empower them with vocabulary, that we help them understand. Autistic children are more prone to be abused. If you know an autistic kid on the spectrum, they often have issues with clothing. Some autistic kids will strip in public. And they have problems with boundaries often. And so someone who might have pedophilia tendencies would take a child's inappropriate boundary issues as meaning they wanted inappropriate touching and that kind of thing to happen. So we have to guard and protect them. A really good way to do that is with vocabulary. Autistic children also, you have to be very careful about sending them to the bathroom alone, even as they get to be older. They need to be educated by a safe person who's the same gender as them so that they can understand things like keeping themselves clean and what's happening to them. Children on the spectrum need a longer period of time to adjust to change. The changes that happen with puberty can be really dramatic to a neurotypical child, but for an autistic child, they can be devastating because change is difficult anyway. The second thing that I want to share with you is I want you to understand, children need to understand that sex is not a bad thing. Sometimes we want to protect them so much that we communicate that sex is naughty, sex is dark. You don't need to know about it till you're older. There's a wonderful book out there by Richard and Linda Iyer called How to Talk to Your Child About Sex, and the main message of the book is teach children that sex is beautiful. Sex is awesome. It's a wonderful thing that happens in a committed relationship when you're ready for adult commitments, adult responsibilities. That's when it happens. Now, in my home, we talk about marriage first. That's our value. And we talk about the beauty and wonderful thing that happens when a man and woman communicate in a fabulous way. And they don't do it with anybody else. That's our value that we teach. And this book, How to Talk to Your Child About Sex, really helps with that. A few years ago, I didn't get this book till my older kids were past the age when Richard and Linda recommend you talk to a child. They recommend the age of 8 is when you first sit down and have that conversation. Well, at the time I had a daughter who was 11, who is very likely on the spectrum. She's not diagnosed. She's in medical school now. She turned out great. But she had a lot of the same tendencies as my child who's diagnosed with autism. Anyway, we laid down on our stomachs on the floor of the bedroom, pulled out this book, How to Talk to Your Kid About Sex, and I just read this stuff to my daughter. A couple of weeks later, I got a note. It was a couple of years later, when she had become interested in boys, and she said, "Mom, thanks for telling me the story about the tower." And I'm going to share this with you really quick. There's a wonderful story in there where they talk about a young man who goes to the Sears Tower in Chicago, huge building. He's so excited, he's never gone there. He saves his money for the plane tickets. He gets there and he goes up the elevator. He's so excited to look out and see the view, but the elevator operator has seen it every day. It's no big deal to him. And I compared this with physical intimacy and how much more special it is if you wait. And it's with one person in a committed relationship. When my daughter was 16 and really discovering boys, she left a note on my pillow saying, "Thanks for telling me the story about the tower." I have no idea what happened, but I'm so glad that I shared that. The third thing that I want to share is be open and be available to answer the questions your children have. That means that you have to give them the information. Empower them with age-appropriate information so that they can function in this crazy world and they can be happy, productive adults with a good sex life. Mr. Toastmaster.